Hey all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and this one we're going over my round 1 game from the Reykjavik Open. Yes, we are actually in April games now, in April of 2019 games, and the Reykjavik Open is honestly one of my favorite tournaments in the world to play. If you've never been to Reykjavik, I strongly recommend giving it a visit. Just the mountainous structures are really beautiful. The city center's fairly small, but quaint, and there's a lot of atmosphere and action going on. They do have a few nice hangout spots at night. There's this hip hop club I really enjoyed called Pikine. But anyways, getting back to the chess, it's just a really good place to play chess. There's just a fantastic atmosphere. The actual arena you play in is the Harpa Concert Hall, and it's this really, really wonderful building. I mean, you just Google it. The structure's incredible, and playing inside it just feels very special. Whenever you're in a nice environment, it almost seems like playing chess is a little bit easier, or at least you're a little more inspired to play. So always a fun trip. This was my second or third time playing the Reykjavik Open. I can't recall. I once played in one of the Icelandic leagues that takes place in some of the months preceding the Reykjavik Open, and at that time I managed to play it right after the league ended. This time I was not playing an Icelandic league, but I still had some relationships with individuals in Iceland that made it a little bit more cost effective to go. And maybe I should give a special shout out to the Butterfly Guest House that has been the place I've stayed the past few times I was in Reykjavik, and received wonderful, wonderful, wonderful hospitality. So yeah. Anyways, if you are in Reykjavik, please consider going to the guest house and definitely checking out all it has to explore. It's a really wonderful place. Back to the game for a moment. So, my opponent in this one was Julius Fridjonsson. I might be blundering that pronunciation, but he was an Icelander. And what happens in an open tournament is you do play down the first few rounds, and you have to sort of prove yourself before working up to a top board. So this was the situation. So anyways, I was black and he was white, and I think he was about expert level. And he went for c4. I went e6, knight f3, d5, b3. b3 is an interesting move. It tries to keep the tension in the center, and it also typically signals a double fianchetto. Even though he played b3 first, you might say, oh, he still can put this bishop on e2. Normally, b3 transposes to double fianchettos where they play Catalan type of structures, and they delay the development of the d-pawn. Why is that? Well, the reason for that is because if you play the pawn to d4 really quickly, and you're putting this bishop on b2, you're almost locking it in on this diagonal. And so typically, if you play b3, you want to keep that diagonal open. Now, black does have the option of going d4 and closing that diagonal down, but it kind of becomes a reverse Benoni. One example would be like d4, e3, c5, let's say bishop b2, knight c6, takes, d3, and you could see here that the position is essentially a reverse Benoni, a tempo up for white. The one difference is that this pawn on e6 is not on e5, which it normally is to reinforce the pawn. And yeah, there are some nuances here, but I didn't really want to play any of these reverse systems a tempo down. So I decided to play a little bit more solidly after b3 and just go knight f6. White went bishop b2, which is normal. I went bishop b7, g3, and then, okay, my thought about the intention of the double fianchetto was kind of confirmed because Julius went for this. Castles, bishop g2, and b6. b6 is a move that you can actually get away with right away if there's no queen a4 or queen b3 trick. Basically, normally in these Queen's Gambit type of structures with the Catalan, you wind up playing c6, b6, and then playing for c5. But what I found is c6 is not something you necessarily have to do if there isn't a ton of pressure on the c6 square. So if I compare it to like a normal Catalan line for a moment, just to give you an example, let's say you went d4, knight f6, g3, bishop b7, bishop g2, castles. This is a normal line. And let's say I played b6 here. b6 here would actually be a mistake because after some, like, let's say like knight e5, bishop b7, well, typically there's this problem with queen a4, and the issue is that here the c6 square is very sensitive, and also if the knight ever moves from b8, let's say to d7, then there's this knight c6 maneuver, which secures the two bishops. So pretty much the difference here is that once white has played b3 like he did in the game, you could see that the queen is not actually coming out to a4 to give additional problems to the c6 square, so it doesn't really require that additional reinforcement. So what I kind of figured out is that you don't really need to go c6, and you can go c5 and one go later, and that's an important tempo. So that's why I went b6 right away. So anyways, white castled. I went bishop b7, d4 was played. And here I was actually wondering, because d4 seemed a little bit unusual to me, locking in this bishop. I was wondering if it would make sense to capture and attack the center, because white is almost giving me the opportunity to play against his hanging pawns. One way that could look is if I go d takes c4, b takes e4, c5, and note that he can't really push d5 because I have 3 pieces on it, and he can't really go he can go d takes c5, but I thought d takes c5 is not ideal because after, let's say, this queen trade, black has a much better structure in terms of this queenside structure. I have 2 pawn islands to white's 3 because the c4 pawn and a2 pawn were split. And you might say, well, what about bishop takes f6? Then you have an additional pawn island. Well, these pawns are actually much easier to cover, and I think the c4 pawn is not. So that was kind of my rationale there. And I was thinking, okay, like, well, c5 probably is a move, but the thing that I wasn't too sure about is after c5, if white goes like e3, and I wasn't sure if I should take here and play against white's hanging pawns or not. Typically, the hanging pawns could be a strength in the middle game because they might facilitate some pressure on the king side in the short term, but in the long term, these pawns are weaknesses and targets because just like in the previous position, there are 3 pawn islands here to black's 2 pawn islands. So it kind of was an open question whether I should play c5. But what I wound up doing actually is playing knight bd7, which was a touch more modest. D takes e4 probably was the right move, should have been considered, but I wasn't ready to kind of like open things up. I wanted to see a little bit more what white was trying to do. Anyways, white went knight c3, just developing, makes sense. And now I went c5 because I thought that now I had all my minor pieces kind of working in the middle of the board, influencing the center. So I thought now was the right time to play c5. And yeah, I was pretty happy with my position here because either way, any way that black takes, or any way that white takes, I have multiple choices. So if white plays like c takes d5, I could take with the pawn or the knight. Same thing with with d takes d5, I can take with the knight or the pawn. So I just felt that I have a lot of good options for recapturing in the center. And the other thing about knight bd7 that I liked is now I stopped this knight e5 stuff because I could trade it and go and move my knight away to g4. So anyways, c takes d5 was played. Both moves are kind of viable here in terms of which way you want to take. And why don't you pause the video actually and give yourself a few minutes to sort of decide which way you would take on d5. So I'm going to give you a moment and then I'm going to say how I did it. All right, so hopefully you got a moment to sort of figure out how you would take on d5. The way I wound up taking was knight takes d5. And the reason I played knight takes d5 is because after e takes d5, this isn't necessarily a bad position, but we have the same quote-unquote problem as before, which is this concept of the hanging pawns. So the point is that now my d5 and c5 pawns are kind of hanging pawns in the middle, and white can sometimes get some pressure on them just by kind of like blockading and taking at the right moment. So one way to do that would be if white just played like rook c1 and then continue to try and add pressure on my central pawns. Now again, this isn't a bad position for me, but it just gives white a little bit more freedom. So I like to preserve my pawn structure. So that's why I went knight takes d5. And after knight takes d5, knight takes was played, and I guess you could tell how I took this way, because if I didn't take with the pawn the last move, I was going to take here and give myself hanging pawns here. So I went bishop takes d5. And you can see here the dust is almost settled and the position is fairly close to equal. I mean, we have a scenario where both sides kind of have reasonable development. Both sides don't have the rooks connected yet, but that'll happen soon. And there's a little bit of tension on this square. So it's pretty much in close to equal position. And, this is a lower rated player, so I do want to create some type of imbalance. But it was important not to panic here because there's still a lot of pieces on the board. So an equal position, didn't really scare me. And I think that's something that, sometimes separates some of the stronger players from some of the weaker players, is that, I don't panic when I get into an equal position because I know this is an opportunity from which I can outplay my opponent. So it wasn't like a huge deal that it's equal, because equal and draw are two very, very different things. And this is way, way away from being a draw. So just keep that in mind. So anyways, rook c1 was played. Reasonable move, keeping the tension in the center. Again, releasing tension can sometimes not be the smartest thing. If he took on c5 right away, I'm trying to think how I would have taken. I think I probably would have played bishop takes c5 just to eye this diagonal. Also make sure my knight on d7 is still eyeing the e5 square. And I think black actually has the easier time of it because my bishop here is a really nice anchored piece. And maybe one day I play a5 and a4 and start to undermine white's queenside. So yeah, so rook c1 was reasonable enough. And now I went rook c8, still keeping tension. Again, neither side really wants to relieve the tension here. And now white played queen d2. Connecting the rooks makes some sense. Again, keeping the tension in the center. And I went for knight f6. And you can see here, we're both kind of playing this little waiting game. Who's going to blink first? Black went rook fd1, said, no, you're going to blink first. And now I went h6. Again, just a useful waiting move, giving my king an escape square, potentially, stopping a queen transfer later, and just kind of waiting to see. White went queen f4, transferring the queen anyway. I think that's a reasonable move because now the rook is on the line of the queen. So my queen is a little bit airy here, and his rooks are connected and mine aren't. But that being said, I have a good foothold in the center with my bishop on d5 and my knight guarding the e4 square, preventing e4 from happening. And so I went bishop d6, challenging this queen on f4 because I really did want my queen to get off of the line of the rook on d1. But note that, queen c7 would be a little bit awkward because, well, white could take and, I might have a problem here being pinned if I take with the bishop, there might be some b4 idea. And, I wasn't sure if I wanted to trade queens or not. And I just like hitting the queen and giving white a decision to make, because in addition to hitting the queen, I also give my own queen on d8 potentially the e7 square to go to. So I thought, all right, we have some options here. So bishop d6, and now white played knight e5, and this was kind of the imbalance I was looking for, because I think knight e5 is a mistake, and yeah, I mean, it's not so clear, but I think just on general grounds, you don't want to voluntarily pin yourself, right? So right now we have a situation where the queen was attacked, and it could have moved somewhere. It could have moved to h4, or maybe somewhere else, but maybe back to d2. But to voluntarily pin yourself doesn't make sense to me with knight e5. So I thought that was a little bit strange on general grounds. But then once you actually move this knight, I kind of was sitting on that because now there's this tension on with the bishops, and I was thinking that by trading these bishops, I might be able to, kind of solidify my position, make sure the light squares in my queen side aren't weak, and maybe even consider that the light squares in white's camp could be weak if the bishops are exchanged. So that was a kind of desirable exchange that I was looking for, because this bishop had to sit on this diagonal to kind of make sure the white bishop did not, enjoy this pretty much free reign on from h1 to a8. So I was happy to see this move. I took on g2, just getting rid of that light square bishop, and after king takes, you could see this pin is still annoying. And I went for knight d5. Now you might say, well, what are you doing? Aren't you just helping the queen out of the pin? Well, the queen moved to e4, still trying to keep an eye on this e5 knight. And now I went for f5, and this was the key part of the idea, was that I wanted to trade this bishop for the knight. And if I trade this bishop for the knight and he has to recapture with the pawn, then this bishop on d2 is kind of a dead piece because its own pawn on e5 would be in the way. Now, f5 is so important because now the queen can't go to a square where it can still protect the knight on e5, so it's pushed away. And additionally, I still have amazing light square control after a potential exchange because I played this f5 move. So it means that my knight on d5 will be secure. So very, very important. And the point is that now, after queen f3, now I played bishop takes a5, d takes e5, and the dust is settled. And even though the material is equal, you can see that it's actually probably a lot easier to play black's position because this knight is going to be more flexible than this bishop on b2, which is really lacking squares right now. And additionally, now that this f pawn is on f5 instead of f7, I can even think about getting an initiative going on the king side with f4 and ripping open white's position. So already here I started to basically set up like a light square complex that was going to trouble the dark squared bishop, and I had that bit of imbalance that you want to have when you want to win the game. So anyways, my queen is in the line of fire still, so I wanted to get that out the way. And so I went queen d7. And the point with queen d7 was to ultimately stay on the light squares, but ultimately shift my queen to a light square like c6 or f7 or something like that. And note that e4 is not something I'm really worried about because I can just go f takes e4, and then I still have a lot of light square pressure on the f file. White did wind up going e4, and after f takes, queen takes, I went rook f5. And the point here was that, in the previous position, before I went queen d7, if I moved somewhere else after, let's say queen e7, after e4, if takes takes, now I can't go rook f5 because of the tactic rook takes d5. And my pawn on e6 is overloaded defending the f5 rook and was trying to protect the d5 knight, so I actually would just lose a rook. So the point is with queen d7, it's kind of prophylactic against e4 and also allows me to set up my rook on a good outpost. And you can see here, look at all of my critical pieces all on light squares. That's a key thing, having them on light squares, playing around the bishop, and then simultaneously setting up some pawns on dark squares so the bishop on b2 is restricted. So it's a little game within the game right now to restrict that bishop. White went king g1, kind of backing up, and I went rook cf8, and it was quite clear to me now that I had a crazy initiative on the f-file. White went rook c2, trying to protect the f2 pawn horizontally, and I went queen f7, and now I have the Alekine's gun, as they say, when you have three heavy pieces lined up like this, and just very, very dangerous position. White went queen g2, protecting f2. Note that f4, which is a move you might consider playing, is extremely risky for a few reasons. First off, you have to be concerned about knight takes f4, and sacrifices like this could actually just lead to mate on f1. So here, white queen has to guard the f1 square, so maybe queen g2 holds. But, very, very risky choice, and I might even have something here. I don't think so, but it's scary to kind of go for this. I mean, maybe queen f5, threatening rook g4, and I think the only move maybe would be h3 to protect rook g4. And that's just one line that you just have to calculate to make sure you're safe. Another thing they have to be worried about at f4 is g5, and I think that was the move I was really thinking about, because again, there's this rook f1 idea if you capture, and then this is pretty much checkmating almost immediately, because if you take, I have queen f1 mate, and if you step up to g2, I just win the rook on d1. So you can't even begin to take there, and then if I take on f4, you see I have a million pieces on f4, and I'm just going to be up a pawn. So with all the threats in the world. So still a really tough spot for white. So queen g2 tries to like not push that pawn, but the problem is now white is being extremely passive. And again, this bishop isn't playing. This rook is purely defensive right now. So is the queen. And so I don't even need to rush here. I just need to take more control. And I did that, I think, in a very, very nice way with the move rook f3. And I must say, this rook f3 maneuver kind of reminded me of a game I'd seen with that AlphaZero actually played with white against Stockfish and a Queen's Indian, where he basically had a bind on these fianchettoed squares and was able to like totally squeeze Stockfish into a lost position. And it felt here that even though the material is equal, the position just seemed lost to me, because a loss for white, because if you look, this queen is now totally cut off and, doesn't really have much to work with. This f pawn on f2 is cut off from the oxygen of the pawn on e5. This bishop is a dead piece, so I just thought the difference in activity is tremendous. After rook f3, white went rook cd2, but he doesn't really have much to do. And in fact, even this exchange sacrifice doesn't really bring much, because I have everything under control. I went h5 now, trying to seize more space. One threat was a dream idea, was a scenario where I might get h5, h4, h3, and then get like a thorn pawn. So for instance, let's just say if white shuffles, I go, let's say I go queen f5, h4, h3, and this wouldn't happen, but let's say something like this with queen h1. This was kind of my dream scenario where this queen is on h1, totally dead, doesn't have any moves, and then I'd be able to go like rook takes f2 and crash through. That was kind of my big idea. And if the queen goes to f1, I might have knight e3 crashing through, because you can't take here because of mate. And if the queen moves, then I hit the rook on d1. So that was kind of my dream idea, to kind of squeeze him and choke him out on the light squares. So after h5, white played rook e1. And I thought about playing h4, but I wasn't sure if maybe he was trying to get in rook e4 and getting some activity. So that's why I played queen f5, taking away the e4 square from the rook, still maintaining my light square complex. And you could just see the difference in activity is tremendous. White played h4 now, stopping me from playing h4, h3. But this doesn't help white's cause too much, because again, there's still a lot of weaknesses on the light squares. I went a5 now, just keeping with that principle of not rushing. Now that I have domination on the king side, I thought, well, why don't I improve on the queen side before going forward? There are probably direct ways to win. I might even be able to play g5 and h4 or something like that. But there's just no need to rush, so I thought I don't need to do that. White played bishop c1, and now I went knight b4, and this was the last kind of maneuver I thought I needed to win the game, was that if my knight could be positioned to a better square, let's say on d4, then it would eye the all-important f3 square, and maybe my knight could replace my rook on f3. But I also would have other, potential squares from d4 like e2 or c2. And so I was just basically almost like a quarterback. My knight from d5 was trying to climb in the pocket with going to d4, but it was going to take a little bit of time. So knight b4, rook d e2. There isn't much white can even do about this. And now knight c2 hitting that rook on e1. And then rook f1 protecting it. And now knight d4. And you can see I managed to move my knight 1, 2, 3 times in a row to get to that square, because white couldn't really do anything. So now after knight d4, I'm attacking e2, and it's also actually even more this knight is even more menacing on d4 than it was on e2, or on d5. So rook e3 was played, And now I went queen c2. And this was the other point, is that now my queen is free to roam now that my knight is also protecting f3. And you can see these queenside pawns are super, super weak. So if I pick off one of them, then the other one will surely collapse. And that was another point with a5, is that now he's not going to be able to liberate and liquidate these pawns because I have too much control. So yeah, the position is totally lost. And after queen c2, white went a4. And pretty much anything loses on the spot. But after a4, I think I found the cleanest way. So why don't you pause your video and try to figure out the tactic that broke through this position for black. All right, hopefully you got a chance to pause the video and figure out what I played here. The move I went in for was rook takes f2. And after rook takes f2, my opponent actually resigned. Why is that? Why did he resign after rook takes f2? Well, the only logical move to recapture is rook takes, right? But now the bishop on c1 is unprotected, so I could go queen takes c1 check. And in addition, now the rook on e3 is unprotected. So the position kind of falls like a house of cards. And if you go rook f1 back, I take on e3 with check. If you go queen f1 to block, I can still take on e3. And the point is now that f8 is not actually hit right now because the rook is pinned to the king. So that's a huge problem. And of course, if king h2, well, I still take this rook. And white would have a few spite checks, but no more than that. I can step up the board and escape this one pretty easily. And then there are no more checks, and I'm up a piece. So yeah, so anyways, after rook takes f2, white resigned, and I got a win in round one, which is great. It was kind of an interesting game, I think, from the standpoint of, you know, having an equal position for a little while and not panicking. I think that's something that is really important, that, you know, ultimately, if you play a long game, the more moves you play, the more opportunities your opponent has to go wrong. And over time, you know, the strength, your strengths should show in some way, shape, or form. I almost liken it to a team in basketball, for instance, like a team that wants to be a team that's more talented in basketball, or really in almost any sport. Their aim should be to have more possessions, because if they have more possessions, it's more opportunities to prove that they're actually better. And it's the same thing in chess in some ways, where like the longer the game goes, the more of I have an opportunity to show where my strengths are, as opposed to a short game where there are less moments to you know, make that determination. So I just kind of stuck with it and thought, you know what, if we play a long one, I'm gonna have a shot. So anyways, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Please like and or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, please do so by making a donation in the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks. Take care.